Okay, so css.lint import statement. Import statements do not load in parallel. So let me show you what this means. If we have a CSS file and we have an import statement such as this one, the problem is that this whole file will load first, and only after it finishes loading can the browser start downloading this second file, which means these two files, this one and this one, will download in sequence, which is an obvious performance problem. So in production, you should always have a link in the HTML to that CSS file so that they can download in parallel. Furthermore, you shouldn't even have two CSS files. You should have one single big CSS file that downloads exactly once the first time the user accesses the website, and then it's cached on the browser and in the network, and no further downloads need to occur, right? So the question is, should we set this as ignore, warning, or error? And the answer is VS Code is a development tool, and there are two kinds of optimizations. You can optimize for code performance, right? Like not having import statements like this one. But that's actually not the first step. That would be the second step. And that's related to the build process. The first step, and I think it's more important than the second step, is optimize for developer performance, right? So the speed at which you can code and recode, refactor your code is much more important than the speed at which it runs on the browser or desktop or whatever you're creating. So sometimes it makes sense to have @import statements in CSS, like when you're theming and a CSS file depends on another one because it's in a hierarchy. So the first step is to optimize the developer performance, which means that you shouldn't be concerned with not having @import statements in your CSS, because if you're doing things correctly, it just makes more sense to have a file that depends on another file being in @import statement. And then if you're doing things correctly, you would have a second step, which is the build process that will concatenate all the CSS into one single big file that only needs to download once. Or you're using some kind of framework like Angular and the CSS is scoped to a particular component. Either way, you should not be worried during the development phase, which is what VS Code is for, about not having import statements in your code. So my advice is ignore this rule.